Research suggests 1 in every 2 dementia cases can be prevented. My guest today is Dr. Mitchell Clionsky. He is a board-certified clinical neuropsychologist with 45 years of experience evaluating and treating patients with mild cognitive impairment, dementia, ADHD, and brain injury. Dr. Emily Clionsky and Dr. Mitchell Clionsky, renowned brain docs, guide you on a path to brain health through their unique evidence-backed approach combining science and psychology, as detailed in the book Dementia Prevention: Using Your Head to Save Your Brain, a publication of Johns Hopkins Press. This book dives into the pressing need to address factors like sleep apnea, social isolation, sensory deprivation, and the importance of treating conditions like depression, which can often be overlooked in the broader context of cognitive health. Together, they've curated a wealth of knowledge and strategies in their book to help you reduce your risk of all-cause dementia. The mission behind the book is brain health awareness, intending to educate and motivate individuals to reduce the impending burden of dementia. In our conversation today, we talk about the book and Dr. Mitchell, both with an extensive professional background and personal experience in dealing with dementia, will enlighten us what we've historically known about dementia prevention and where we currently stand. With his guidance, we'll explore the landscape of treatments on the horizon for dementia and Alzheimer's. He also provides practical and actionable insights to those feeling overwhelmed about where to begin in dementia prevention. If you're curious, there is a self-assessment in their book and even a free version on their website, braindoc.com, to start you on this journey. So whether you're concerned for yourself, a loved one, or simply curious, join us today as we unravel the intricacies of dementia and discover ways to guard our most precious possession, our brain. Thank you, Mitchell, for sharing this valuable information and enriching our podcast today. Here is my interview with Dr. Mitchell Clionsky. Hi, Mitchell. Thank you for being with me. We were just saying we're so glad the day is finally here that we get to have this conversation. So thank you.
I'm very excited to be here, Nicole. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. And this is a big conversation. We've got a lot that we want to talk about. And I thoroughly enjoyed reading your book. I thought it was full of great information. I've been in this field for a while and I learned so much, and I felt like, for as maybe overwhelming the topic can be for people at times, the book read extremely, it was digestible, and I was able to follow along and learn a lot of really good information. So for anyone out there, they'll need to go pick up your book and purchase it for themselves to be able to go back and digest everything that we're going to talk about today. So
That's wonderful. And that was really our purpose, was to take a wide-ranging amount of very scientifically based information and then not dumb it down, but rather translate it into terms that most people would understand and pull it together into a coherent and cohesive kind of picture. So as you know, there's a building of the various elements of our model from chapter to chapter, so that you don't have to try to pick it all up at once, but rather you can take it in steps and then come to something that is comprehensive, so that it follows all of the important scientific findings, but allows people to then apply it to their own lives. Because it's one thing to be educated. It's another thing to use the information to be able to affect a change, to make a change that's going to reduce your risk of developing dementia now into the future.
That's so true. And that's exactly what it does. I loved the visual component of it. You took so much information, but for me, I was able to really clearly see what we were learning about, how to apply it to my life. And we'll kind of get into more of the nuts and bolts of that. With your background, share a little bit with us about that and what led you to write this book, Dementia Prevention.
Well, the you here is a plural because you refers to myself. I'm a clinical neuropsychologist. I'll explain in a minute what that is. The other you is my wife, Dr. Emily Clionsky, who is a medical doctor. First had a residency in internal medicine, practiced internal medicine for 4 years, then decided she was going to take a second residency because she hadn't been abused enough in her first one,
No.
and became a psychiatrist. But
Amazing.
her interest in psychiatry was in elements of neurology,
Mm.
how our brains work, and particularly what happens to people as they age and begin to experience problems with their thinking. My background is a PhD neuropsychologist. So I have a doctorate in clinical psychology with advanced training in how the brain functions. So I look at how people pay attention, how they're able to learn, how they're able to remember new information.
Mm.
I look at how they're able to solve problems and communicate information to other people and what impact emotional states may have on that as well. So we give a lot of tests in my practice. We give tests to people who come in and they're wondering, in many cases,
Mm-hmm.
is this just a normal part of aging, or am I developing some problems I need to take care of? In some cases, it's later than that. They're brought in by family caregivers who are saying, I'm really worried about my mom or dad, my aunt, uncle, my husband or wife, my brother or sister, whoever it might be. And we can use our tests to look at how those people score on the tests and compare them with how they should score.
Mm.
Because depending on your age and depending on your education and your occupational background, maybe you're going to be missed as having a problem. If you're a really smart person and it's pretty early in the process, you're then functioning at an average level for someone who didn't start out that smart. So those people are often missed very early on. So we're able to identify them when it really makes a bigger difference
Mm-hmm.
early in the dynamic process of dementia, which is a progressive neurological condition. So people's brains are changing in a negative way,
Mm-hmm.
both in terms of the size, but also in terms of the internal structure and how different areas of the brain work with each other.
Fascinating. And I just had a conversation with a family member of mine whose parents both had dementia. And what I'm finding and having conversations with other older adults and family caregivers is that they have more fear and concern when they've seen their loved one walk through that. And so we had this great dialogue about what to do, and I had just read your book, so it was awesome. I could tell him go pick up the book, but what I had learned, his question to me was, is there a recommendation for people to get a baseline test before they maybe notice any brain changes happening so that there can be that comparison? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, it's a really great question. And in the ideal world, that's exactly what we would do. In the real world, if you're using an insurance company to pay for that evaluation, they're not going to cover it because there's not a medical rationale for it.
Interesting.
So, in some ways, we spend a lot of money when someone gets sick and not nearly enough money in preventing them from getting sick. But it's the way our healthcare model is set up.
Right.
What I advocate is I believe that physicians, nurse practitioners, physicians' assistants should be doing brief testing of cognition as a normal part of annual visits
Mm-hmm.
so that they're laying down a less comprehensive but much more doable kind of baseline. And in fact, as you know, because you previously had sent me a question about this,
Mm-hmm.
you know that we actually developed a test that doctors can use exactly for this purpose that only takes 5 to 7 minutes and can give them a very reliable marker for someone's baseline level that they can follow over time
Mm-hmm.
and then be able to be concerned at an appropriate point
Right.
if that person is beginning to decline. But that would be an actionable kind of step today.
Mm-hmm.
When the change occurs, if it does, then you can obtain an imaging study of the brain, like an MRI. You can get blood tests to a greater degree. You can get more comprehensive testing, like I do, so that you're able to really get a finer picture. And then you have an actionable, but also reimbursable from insurance company
Mm.
kind of reason for doing it.
Right.
So I think it's a stepwise thing. You start with the screening, the same way you get a mammogram,
Yeah.
the same way you get a colonoscopy. So that's what I would propose.
Yeah. Well, I hope that happens. It is something that, as we're having more awareness around dementia, Alzheimer's, there is that need. And I think for people too to have that peace of mind or at least know what their baseline is, it would make complete sense to me that that should be implemented widely. So I hope
There is
that is the
something that
case.
just came out. The Centers for Medicare Services, CMS, just came out with a proposal based on some new legislation that came through the present presidential administration that is going to offer coordinated care incentives and demonstration projects across the country.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going to try to see how they can have care coordinators to help families steer this very confusing and complex system of getting medical and other kinds of care for their loved ones.
Yeah.
The issue that's going to remain, unless they address this within the model, is how do you identify people earlier
Mm-hmm.
when there's more we can do? Because it's very important that we pick people up at the mildest stages of dementia and even in a pre-dementia state called mild cognitive impairment.
Mm-hmm.
That's where you have a lot of options and you can actually stop this progression or turn it around. And a number of the patients we've seen at the MCI, mild cognitive impairment stage,
Mm-hmm.
2 years later are back to normal cognition. They're not even still at MCI and
Wow.
they haven't progressed to dementia. So that's the exciting thing. If we
Yeah.
can start early enough, we can do something based on today's technology without even hoping for tomorrow's medications.
Right. That's incredibly hopeful. It is. And your test is called the 5 minute memory orientation screening test,
Just
where
called
the
the memory
most.
orientation screening
Yeah.
test. It's a 5 minute
I
test,
like
but
it.
that's
Yes.
not part of the title.
Got it. Okay, the most.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I and that's the one that we're hoping that is widely adopted to implement early on.
We've actually had it out on the market for quite a number of years, not very widely used. For a while, we had a version that was with another company called the MD Most, and most recently, we had it for about 5 years with a big diagnostic company called Quest Diagnostics
Mm-hmm.
that was called the Cognizance test. But now we are reformulating it, reissuing it, and hopefully we'll have this back on the market in its new and expanded format somewhere in the next 6 months.
Okay.
So at that point, we're going to really be trying to get doctors to adopt this
Right.
in a regular, routine
Mm-hmm.
kind of way, because that's the way it works.
Yeah.
You want to see people over time and figure out where they are and do the proper things at the earliest possible time.
Right. Right. Exactly. Well, that's good. We'll look for that. And for our listeners that may not be familiar, I know people that are listening have had some experience with dementia in their life. You touched on it a little bit, explaining what it is, but there are also different types. And I know that's probably a whole podcast in and of itself. But set the stage for us so we know exactly what we're going to be looking at today.
Dementia itself is basically a progressive neurological condition. So it's a brain disease that starts pretty early on. The changes can be seen as early as 10 or 15 years before people really start experiencing problems, but develops over time and then progresses more rapidly as the person's cognitive reserve, sort of their bench strength. If you're a basketball team, you got the
Mm-hmm.
starting five, but then you got another, I don't know,
Yeah.
5 to 10 people on the bench to bring them in when the first five get tired. Well, we have bench strength too. It's called cognitive reserve. And when we begin to lose that, that's when you start seeing all the real problems in everyday functioning. Dementia itself is a broad category. It's like saying automobile.
Mm-hmm.
Inside the category, you have different types of dementia. In the same way, in automobile, you've got Fords and Chryslers and Toyotas and Hyundais and different kinds. They're all somewhat similar, but different enough that people who are pretty knowledgeable could look and say, no, that's a Ford. That's not a Chevrolet.
Yeah.
Well, in dementia, we've got Alzheimer's disease, which is the one that most people are familiar with. Some people say it's the disease, the type of dementia that's the most common. They're sort of right, not exactly, because there's also a lot of vascular dementias. So people who've had strokes, heart attacks, chronic problems with blood pressure or diabetes, they develop a wear and tear syndrome on their circulation system that gets in the way of their thinking well. Turns out that the combination of Alzheimer's and vascular dementia are really the most common form. Sort of hard to find people who have just Alzheimer's disease. In fact, something was just recently published looking at some of these brand new medications that have come out, the lecanemab, otherwise known as Leqembi, and the aducanumab, also known as Aduhelm, and finding that somewhere between only 5 to 10% of people are going to be eligible to take these medications because they're the only ones who are caught early enough in the process and have pure enough forms of Alzheimer's disease that they're likely to benefit from them. So you have this much larger group who have this combination of different types. Plus, you also have dementias as part of Parkinson's disease. It's not bad enough that people with Parkinson's have a movement problem and that a good number of them have depression. There's also about 25 to 30% of them who develop thinking and remembering problems, dementias along the way. Then you have the people who have had viral encephalopathies. They've been bitten by ticks and mosquitoes. They've had exposures that have caused high fevers or other illnesses. You have the people who have had their heads hit too many times, either through repetitive sports or through boxing or other kinds. Sometimes it's even just one blow to the head can be enough to cause a later life decline in thinking abilities. You have the people who have had too many alcoholic beverages throughout the course of their life, so they have a specific type of alcohol-induced dementia. Then you have the frontotemporal dementias, the stuff that Bruce Willis has come out of, and been very vocal about having, which is really a very different kind of dementia altogether. So basically, it's a long answer to a short question, but there's a whole variety of different types of dementias, and many of them involve elements of several different things.
They do.
So we look at the whole picture. All dementias is our focus.
Thank you for explaining that. It just gives us a picture of what we're going to be looking at today. Do you find that historically there's been one train of thought about what the current understanding of the main cause of dementia is? I know now with more research, we know more, which is what you're sharing about in your book about preventing that. But what are you seeing and what are you finding?
Things in dementia research go in waves. So we used to be really interested in hardening of the arteries, all the vascular factors. And then back in the 1990s, people started getting really interested in beta amyloid, which is a sticky substance that develops inside brain cells and between brain cells that forms or gathers together or forms plaques. And also the same beta amyloid in some of the proteins like tau protein, TAU, tau protein, will destroy the structure of brain cells, causing what's called neurofibrillary tangles. This is a rediscovery also of something very old because back in the early 1900s, a guy named Fisher first found the plaques and tangles. About 5 years later, Alzheimer came along and also found the same plaques and tangles that Fisher had discovered. So he got named for the disease, even though Fisher's miliary bodies were there. He just got to the naming place too late. Alzheimer got to name it. Later on, though, we're now trying to separate these out because we're trying to design treatments that may be more specific. So there's a bigger push now to try to differentiate what's this and what's that. So you'll see there's now scans that will tell us how much plaque there is in the brain of someone. And at a certain level, we decide it's probably at least partly Alzheimer's disease. There was recently a blood test, not yet FDA approved, but still released by Quest Diagnostics, that you can get a doctor to prescribe, that'll tell you how much amyloid there is in your blood. I don't recommend this because I don't think it leads to anything new or different in terms of treatment. Same way I don't recommend genetic testing routinely for people to find out whether or not they have the APOE4 allele and how many copies of it they have, because it's not going to change what they're going to do to prevent dementia. It's only going to worry them. And frankly, there's enough worries out there without having to buy new ones.
Right. And could the stress alone maybe aid in some of that? I don't know, cortisol or things that aren't good for us anyways.
Maybe there's,
Yeah.
stress is an interesting thing. Certain levels of stress are really good because they motivate us. And the more coping skills we have, the more that stress is a positive thing. Because one of the big problems you see in people who retire is they've got great coping skills, but not nearly enough change, enough stress going on in their lives. They're bored to death. On the other hand, if you don't have a whole lot of extra coping because you're really stressed out already, and you add more stress to that, it can be a problem, and certainly over a prolonged period of time. That's where you get into the cortisol being present too long and really causing harm to your health.
Oh my gosh, did that make sense? I get that. It is one of those things where we have all of these different components, and that is what I appreciated was that in the book, it looks at that it's not just one factor that contributes or that has us in that prevention mode, but it's a combination of many different factors. And could you categorize for us what those umbrella over those different factors are? And I love the diagram because I could so easily see the picture of this is in this category, and then we're looking at, let's say alcohol or whatever the category is. I would love your overview of what categories we're looking at.
Yeah, this is probably the most interesting and hardest part of doing the book because we're pulling together research from a wide variety of different fields of study. So there's things in there dealing with cardiology and endocrinology and neurology, psychiatry, exercise physiology, because there's contributions from each of these things.
Yeah.
So imagine that you've got a certain resting level of dementia risk, and you're born with some of this because as like it as we might, we can't change our genes. Not from a birth point of view. You're born with the same kind of risks to some extent that your parents have given you. But there's also early life experiences which can contribute to your dementia risk. If your parents didn't take vitamins during your mom while she was pregnant, that's going to increase your risk. If you've had any kind of birth trauma, if there's emotional disturbance in your young life, that extra stress can make it set you up for problems later on, especially depression and anxiety disorders. But also, we know that in your adolescence, you may have decided to jump off into the shallow end of the pool rather than the deep end and land on your head, or you might have gotten into a car accident. Other things can cause trauma, which sort of are in the background for most of the people going to be reading the book. What they're going to be focused on are things that are more often in their 30s and later on through their 50s and 60s. So here you start getting into a lot of the circulation issues, the cardiovascular issues. Midlife is when this is really at its most important level. In the center of this, for many people, is obesity. Why is that? Well, because if you're weighing more than your body is designed for, and that's how I view obesity, it's not a shaming thing, it's not an attraction thing. It's, our bodies are built for a certain level of weight. That's why they're efficient. If we've got more than that, it's sort of like overloading your trunk. You're not going to get such great gas mileage. Well, it turns out that because that's a central pathway and it's fueled by how much you eat and how little you exercise, so those things are in balance with each other, then you're also going to have problems in many cases with high blood pressure and with diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is typically a disease of people who are not exercising enough and who are consuming too many calories and carbohydrates. And we try to balance that out by taking medications to lower, basically to manage that extra load. And it's partly effective, but not usually entirely effective. Smoking also is a big issue at that point. And for anyone who's still smoking cigarettes, I have basically one word: don't. It's as simple as that. I mean, we can talk about it forever and ever, but it increases the risk of stroke and heart attack and deprives you of oxygen, which is really important. The other thing that's key here that isn't picked up by most people studying dementia is the role of breathing, especially breathing while you're asleep, a condition called sleep apnea. For us, this is sort of the secret sauce in the recipe because it's usually underdiagnosed. It's caused by the fact that while we're sleeping, we stop breathing or our oxygen levels drop 5 or more times per hour. But when that happens, not enough air gets down our lungs, not enough oxygen gets pulled out of the air to get attached to our red blood cells. And so those oxygen molecules do not make it to our brain. Consequently, we don't have enough oxygen to make an energy protein called ATP, which is what powers our cells. So we're tired a lot. We oftentimes are waking up repeatedly during the middle of the night, so we're not getting good sleep. There's also a system that occurs and works while we're asleep. It's called the glymphatic system. It begins with the letter G. The whole purpose of the glymphatic system is to flush out byproducts of thinking. So in the same way that you or I are working at our desks during the day, and we accumulate papers and trash and things, well, at the end of the day, either we or someone else has to empty out the trash cans and clean off the surfaces for the next day. Our brain produces trash, produces byproducts in the course of normal thinking. Well, where does that get flushed out? Well, it gets flushed out during the period of sleep when we're not dreaming, called non-REM sleep. And that only works if you have good levels of oxygen. There's several other things that also don't go so well if we don't have enough oxygen. But believe me when I tell you that it's really important to breathe. I know that sounds so simple-minded, but yet it's so overlooked. Here's a really interesting study just published about the first week in August. They looked at 6,000 people who were tested in 5 different centers across the United States. These were major research centers. The one that I'm most familiar with is near me in Massachusetts. It's called the Framingham Heart Study. And what they do is they follow people in cohorts over periods of 5, 10, 15, sometimes 20, 25 years. Well, they've now joined into a consortium with 4 or 5 other centers. And they decided to give everybody in their new cohort a one-night home sleep test. So they would sleep for one night with this little gizmo on their finger or under their nose, and it would measure how many times they stopped breathing per hour and what happened to their heart rate and a couple other functions. Well, it turns out that if you're over the age of 58 and you don't have any history of dementia and you don't have any real symptoms of sleep apnea, you still have a 50% chance of having sleep apnea.
Interesting.
That's a huge number. So getting back to what we should be doing in terms of colonoscopies, mammograms, we should also be doing a one-night sleep study every 5 years, starting at age 50 or 55, to pick this up, because sleep apnea is not just related to dementia. It's also related to attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It's related to heart attack risk, stroke risk, diabetes risk. Here's another little tidbit for any of the people in your audience who are wondering about this. Half of the men who go to the sexual dysfunction clinics for that little blue pill, guess what disorder they have?
No way.
Sleep apnea.
Wow.
It's circulation.
Yeah.
If oxygen is not getting to the periphery of our entire body, those endpoints don't work so well.
I feel like sleep is one of those conversations that we're waking, no pun intended,
I love it.
waking
We're
up
waking
to.
up
Yeah,
for.
waking up to. I've had people in my life. So my dad, who got tested for sleep apnea. This was a few years ago now, and now has a CPAP because I had started hearing inklings of this conversation going on a few years ago and encouraged him to look into it. One of my interviews that I did with a woman by the name of Allison Schreier, she is the CEO of and founder of Zinnia TV, and her husband was diagnosed at a very young age with FTD. And they found it took them years to get the diagnosis. They thought it was a lot of other things going on, but they found that he had severe sleep apnea. Severe sleep apnea. And she is convinced that that is obviously played a role in the dementia diagnosis that he received. So it is something to take extremely seriously and to look at. And we don't often hear that associated with dementia prevention. We are a little bit more now. So I'm really glad that you spoke to that and brought that up. And now anyone in my life, I'm like, get a sleep test, you know? Yeah.
You're following my playbook. I can't tell you the number of
Mm-hmm.
friends who I've had go for sleep tests.
Mm-hmm.
And you know something? The probabilities are such that if they're over the age of 50, they're likely to have this.
Mm-hmm.
And if they decide that this is something they can wrap their head around, that they can use a CPAP machine, they can put it on when they go to bed, sleep through the night with it, they start waking up with more energy in the morning, their thinking becomes more fluid and clearer. They're now reducing their risk by a significant amount of getting other medical problems right
Mm-hmm.
then, but also getting dementia as they age. I feel really lucky that I got diagnosed 17 years ago
Oh, good. Yeah.
when I was 55 and started
Mm-hmm.
using a CPAP back then,
Mm-hmm.
because I actually think better at 72 than I did in midlife.
Isn't that something? I mean, that speaks to how well it's serving your brain to have that.
Well,
Yeah.
oxygen, who would
Yeah.
have thunk it?
Just the basic thing we need, right?
But yet it's
Oh.
missing
Mm-hmm.
in. So, one of the things that's interesting about dementia
Mm-hmm.
is that the statistics that have been developed tell us that 1 out of every 2 cases of dementia is preventable. That's a huge
That's
undertaking
huge.
when you think about it.
Yeah.
1 out of 2. And this is based on basically 3 studies. The first 2 come out of the Lancet Commission in Great Britain. Back in 2017, the Lancet Commission, which was a blue ribbon panel, I don't know, about 28 different doctors and scientists, looked at all of the various factors that they thought contributed to dementia risk. And what they calculated was if everybody followed these and
Mm-hmm.
dealt with them in their own lives, they would reduce the risk of dementia in the ensuing 10 years by about 40%. 3 years later, they went back. They actually added a variable at that time. I think it was hearing loss, and decided it was more like 42%. Not to be outdone, a couple of years later in 2022, a group in the United States used data from what's called the Health and Retirement Survey,
Mm-hmm.
1,800 people who were followed over time. They applied the Lancet model. They also added a little tweak to that as well. And they came up with a 60% prevention number. So you got 40% on one side, 60% on the other side. So let's say 1 out of 2. But guess what? Sleep apnea was not even considered.
No.
If
Wow.
we add sleep apnea to the formula, you're now really increasing this. We don't know what the statistics are because no one's got it in their model except basically us.
Yep. Yep.
But it's such a key piece of doing it. So everybody I
Mm-hmm.
see gets for clinically gets asked about it. And these days, after that other study came out showing a 50% likelihood, I pretty much send everybody for a home sleep study
Mm-hmm.
because it's so easy, it's painless, it's one night, it's cheap, it's a couple $100 retail.
Yeah.
So the insurance companies are paying even less for that. And it's so related to so many things. Why not you may come up with something that's really treatable. And I'm so glad to hear that your dad's doing it, because he probably's going to add 5 years to his life.
Oh, thank you. I am too. And now I'm like you, championing it for most people in my life. I ask that question, how are you sleeping? Uh, as a younger person, well, I'm in my 40s, but I know that we've got people in our life that are older. We see our parents or grandparents possibly going through symptoms of dementia and navigating that. But I know that there isn't as much awareness, which is what I'm also trying to do, that it is so preventable, right? When you give those stats of the percentage, one and two, right?
Mhm.
So I think that having the conversation and letting people know all of the things that we can put in place and be aware of at any age, just the importance of that for our brain health for a lifetime.
And that's one of the reasons why we have self-assessment
Mm-hmm.
in the book.
Mm-hmm.
But you know something? You don't even have to buy the book to do the self-assessment, because we also have it for free on our website. So if you go to braindoc.com, braindoc, braindoc.com, you can download the PDF, fill out the questionnaire. There will be some things, some lab tests, some other numbers that you probably won't know, and will have to get your doctor to order. But there are some areas that are going to be easy for you to fill out, and you're really going to get an assessment for yourself of where you're on target or where you're off target, or where you're in the middle, sort of near the target. For a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people, for example, the ideal range of blood pressure is about 130 over 80. 120 over 70 is ideal. 130 over 80 is now considered to be good enough. And they'll
Mm-hmm.
find, oh, I'm about 10 points off. What can I do for that? Or they might find that they're having a few more cocktails per night than they really should,
Mm.
or that, like me, they don't use a shot glass, so they're a little heavy when they're
Yeah.
pouring.
Yeah.
I always ask my patients, when you drink a cocktail, do you use a shot glass, or do you pour like your
Right.
neuropsychologist
Right.
pours?
Yeah.
They laugh.
Kind of guesstimate on the glass. Yeah.
Exactly. It all fits into one
Yeah, it
glass.
is.
It
Yeah,
won't be that
that
much.
works. Oh,
So they could pick and choose and say, okay, here's some areas
mm-hmm.
I can work on.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
Yep.
you may need some things from the book in order to figure out how can I start that work,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
we spend a lot of time talking about change and how
Mm-hmm.
people can change their behavior,
Mm-hmm.
but at least they'll give you a sense of where am I right now.
Yes, I thought that was so helpful, the actionable tools. And I did take the little uh, checklist at the end.
Yeah.
And it was good for me to identify, okay, here are some areas of improvement, but I was pleasantly surprised that for the most part had some, good things in place. Going back to the prevention piece, one thing I think is so important that it's that social connection and relationships. You talk a lot about that in terms of, isolation or that sensory loss. Can you expand on that more about how that really impacts our brain health?
One of the sections of the model that you're alluding to looks at how our relationships with the world, our ability to understand what's going on with the world, how involved we are with the world, impacts our dementia risk. So
Mm-hmm.
here's where it gets really interactively interesting. One of the things that's come out recently is we know that hearing loss is a cause for memory loss.
Mm-hmm.
It actually results in a thinning of the surface of our brain in the auditory association cortex, which is connected to our memory centers. And also, when they do a test called the fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, which they can look at the connectivity of different areas of the brain, they find that there's a network in our brain called the salience network that doesn't work as well with people who have hearing loss. Well, salience network says, oh, that's interesting. I got to pay attention to that. And
Mm-hmm.
people who have hearing loss, even if it's subtle, are missing parts of what's going on with the world around them. Vision loss also interacts. So, any kind of sensory loss, and if you're doubly cursed and have poor vision and poor hearing, that really increases your risk for developing dementia. The other thing that's important about those kinds of sensory losses is they cut you off from doing interactive things. It's not so much fun to talk with people when you really can't hear everything that's going on. You miss the subtleties of the jokes. You end up asking them to repeat themselves to the point where they become irritated with you. So we want people to be more connected. The Surgeon General is telling us that there's an epidemic, national health crisis of loneliness. And I believe that to be true. And part of that crisis can be averted by people doing more things interactively. Problem is that when you're not hearing well, when you're not seeing well, you're less likely to do it. Also, then you may become depressed. We know that chronic depression is a cause for dementia. There was a new study, again, just a couple months old, because they keep coming out. It's funny. I sit there and I say, "Oh, yeah, I know this. I've seen this before. There's another study. Great. Well, can I change behavior with this study? That's the question. Will the facts make a difference, or is it just telling me, yep, here's another study where they found the same truth to be evident?" So we've known depression, and we push people all the time to go and treat depression. Don't just live with it because you think that that's all that there can be. There's medications for this. There's therapies for this. There's activities for this. Don't just accept depression as part of life. Actively do your best to treat depression. So these are all interactive. If you don't hear well, you're more depressed. If you don't see well, you're less likely to go out and do things. And people, become isolated. And that's really, really important. And then you do other things. They cope with it by taking benzodiazepines, anti-anxiety medications. Guess what? Those will also interfere with your thinking. They can't sleep. So they'll go out and get over-the-counter sleeping aids, the ones with a PM at the end of the name, such and such PM. Well, because you can buy them without a prescription doesn't mean that they aren't potentially a problem, because most of these contain Benadryl, something called diphenhydramine, which suppresses an important memory chemical in our brain called acetylcholine. In fact, acetylcholine is so important that the currently available drugs to treat dementia all try to maintain acetylcholine. The drugs that most people take for sleep suppress acetylcholine. So you've now doubled down on that problem by suppressing your acetylcholine. They also drink because it helps to numb the pain. And so they say, well, I feel better when I have a couple drinks. And if I felt better with a couple, I may feel even better now with a couple more. So now you have this very interactive, and that's hopefully one of the other things that comes through with the book, is that there is no one thing. These things all work in a coordinated way, either for the bad and cause dementia or for the good. Because if you can start changing some of these, you can affect positive change in other areas just because of your initial success.
One thing, there's not one because they do all live together, but is there one that's more commonly overlooked or dismissed than the other at this moment? Or where you're finding that you're really having to kind of champion that cause?
I look at it as a holistic kind of approach because everyone's profile of strengths and weaknesses is a little different. By the way, it does not come from what you're eating. There's a lot of books sold on Alzheimer's diets and dementia diets. If it were that easy, a couple things. Number one, we've already fixed it.
This is true, yes.
But people keep saying because we're Americans. We want to eat our way into better health. What can I eat? How can I diet in a way that's going to give me this benefit? Is there a simple pill, doctor, that I can take? What about this thing that somebody said on TV, help them to remember better? Does that work? Those are the kind of questions I get asked. And the answer is no, that doesn't work. That the diet, it's good to have a good diet. And if you really have a horrible diet, then any one of those dementia diets will be a step up for you, and it's probably worth doing. But if you have a normally healthy diet, eating a couple extra green leafy vegetables or blueberries or substituting olive oil for butter, It's going to help a little bit. It's not going to make a big enough difference that you're
Mm,
really going to notice. So if it's a choice between figuring out what to cook that's going to fit into your diet or taking a walk,
yeah.
you got to take the walk. That's going to be much better for you in the long run. Or call up a friend and say, "Hi, I haven't heard from you in a while.
Yeah.
How you doing?" Or read something,
Yeah.
or stretch your mind, or
Mm-hmm.
pick up a volunteer job.
Mm-hmm.
Be active is really what I think is much more of a
Mm.
of an issue for people. Whenever I see people and I say, "What are you doing?" and they say, "Not much," I say, "That's our goal. We got to change that because that's a problem for you. If it isn't right now, it will become a problem when not much is all you can do."
Yeah. I'm so glad that you spoke to that because I feel like we do put so much pressure on ourselves to want to have the right diet. And then it deters us or it takes up so much of that mental energy when we could be implementing some of those other things. And just the importance of that it is that holistic picture, but really being active and that social connection plays such a big role in our life for that.
It's really important that we are social beings.
Mm-hmm.
That's the biggest takeaway about people. We live
Mm-hmm.
together, we eat together. There's restaurants in certain cities, New York being one of them, that have special tables for people who want to eat with someone else but are alone. Where this was pre-COVID. I don't know if they still have those now
Mm-hmm.
because it probably was a zone of infection back in 2020. But these days, but before that, there were special tables that you could eat and just have a place to have a conversation so that you could connect with other people. We're built this way.
Mm-hmm.
We weren't built to be isolated.
We are. And I'm hopeful that those restaurants come around again. I don't know if I've seen that lately, but hopefully soon.
I think we're all wondering
Oh,
whether we're going to have to duck and cover this fall
I
when there's an
know.
increase, a spike again. So that may not
I
happen for a
know.
while.
I know. I wondered that too. I wondered that too. Is there promising treatments on the horizon? I know you just had mentioned a couple of those, medications that have come out recently that delays it correctly. We don't have a cure. So what are you seeing as the landscape of what's to come?
Well, the two new drugs, and there's the third one called donanemab. These are all from a class called monoclonal antibodies,
Mm-hmm.
and they all work to clear out amyloid plaques from our brain. Problem is, they don't improve thinking. They do in mice. If you take a mouse and you genetically engineer its brain to be similar to someone with Alzheimer's disease, and we've used these models for a number of years, and you give them any one of these,
Mm-hmm.
not only does it clear out their amyloid, but they're able to now solve problems they had stopped being able to solve. Not so with people. When you look at the research that's come out of these studies about these new medications, I unfortunately don't see them as being any different than the medications we've had on the market for the last nearly 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
Medications that used to be called Aricept and Exelon and now are called donepezil and rivastigmine, used to be called Remenil, now called galantamine, used to be called Namenda, now called memantine. So
Mm-hmm.
for people in your audience who have cared for someone, they're probably familiar with those names. They also slow down the progression of dementias and not just Alzheimer's.
Mm-hmm.
They actually have a far easier side effect profile than these new medications. So I'm going to be a late adopter of these new, very expensive infusion medications. I don't think they've been out long enough for me to see the long term benefit.
Mm-hmm.
They're so showing some statistically significant differences in the rate of decline
Mm-hmm.
in the first 2 years. But we don't know what's going to happen in years 3 through 5, for example. If there was something where they say, "Oh no, they're now improving their thinking, look at this, they're now better," I would be in a far different position in terms of recommending them
Mm-hmm.
because we haven't seen that before with the existing medications. But the existing medications basically slow them down to about the same rate.
Mm.
So I'm not that impressed.
Yeah.
But people say, "Well, but it's hopeful." And I say, yes, of course it's hopeful, but I'd rather urge people to do what they can now to change the trajectory of this. We actually did a study of this with about 700 patients, presented it at the 2014 American Academy of Neurology, not slouches, American Academy of Neurology, big time organization, back in 2014. We followed 700 of our patients over the course of 2 years using this dementia prevention approach, treating sleep apnea, getting rid of some contributing medical conditions, evaluating for some we didn't even get to talk about, issues with vitamin B absorption, some of the other things that are going on, and treating them with existing medications. The group that we did this for got better by about 15% within the first 6 months.
Wow.
Stayed better over the ensuing year and a half, separated out from a group not treated this way, that was treated in the community, but we had the chance to evaluate at the same interval. So we were able to show that this kind of approach, this comprehensive approach, using what we already have, can really work for a number of people. Not everybody, but enough people that it really makes sense to treat everyone coming in your office as a potential person for stabilization and maybe even improvement.
Oh, completely. And I'm surprised you had talked about in your book, and I guess I had not thought of this before, but there is not a distinct field of dementia. There are no dementologists. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
That's my made-up word,
I know, I
dementiologist.
liked it. Yeah, I was like, oh, I get that. Which is fascinating to me that that isn't in place. Do you think that that's something that will come to be as we're such a large part of our population? And I guess you can speak to the stats of that too. What are the projections of looking at the dementia diagnosis in the future?
Well, it's growing because the population is getting older. So when you have people back in early 1900s dying on average at about age 50, and now the average lifespan is about 78, and we know that all dementias increase in likelihood as we get older. So you get about a 10% risk in your mid-60s, about a 20% risk in your mid-70s, and about a 40% risk when you get to be in your mid-80s. Well, so as you have more and more people in their 70s and 80s, and now in their 90s, you have more and more people in need of treatment because they're going to be statistically more likely to get this. So that's really important. And I hope that there are dementiologists, because I do think that it's beyond the scope of each of the individual specialties that are now dealing with these things.
Right.
Sleep medicine deals with a lot of things,
Yeah.
including sleep apnea, but not so much with dementia, but they
Right.
contribute.
Right.
Neurology, they're dealing with strokes and tumors. They're dealing with injuries to the brain. They're dealing with seizure disorders, multiple sclerosis, lots of different Parkinson's disease, and some neurology.
Yeah.
Psychiatrists, most of them are dealing with depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, other kinds of purely psychiatric disorders, and just a little bit of dementia. It's an outgrowth of some things that happen to your heart, but cardiologists aren't interested.
Right. Right.
So
Yeah.
we need somebody who's a dementiologist.
I was going to say, when you look at all the factors that contribute to that, right, risk, you say, which I thought was so fascinating, it's really a combination of the field of neurology, psychiatry, endocrinology, cardiology, neuropsychology, exercise physiology, internal medicine, pulmonology, sleep medicine, audiology, and genomics.
Genomics, yeah.
So really,
And yet
who's
specialists,
doing all that? Right.
you know what a specialist is? A specialist who knows more and more about less and less. They get more and more focused. The joke is they know more and more about less and less until eventually they know everything about nothing. Not exactly true, but they read their own literature. They get very immersed in very specific areas, and God love them for doing that. That's really, really important for people to have those kind of specialists. But so we need someone for dementia.
Yeah.
Who can that be?
Yeah. Yeah. You?
Not in this lifetime. But you take a
Yeah.
neuropsychologist,
All right.
into
Combine all of it.
interns,
Yeah.
turned psychiatrist
Right.
who are married to each other
Yes.
and willing to figure out how to make this a part of their lives and their practice. And
Oh.
hopefully we get close enough to
Mhm.
that that's going to educate people and maybe start a movement where people
Yeah.
start asking themselves, what am I doing for dementia
Mhm.
prevention today?
Mhm.
What did I
Yes.
do today? Did
Yes.
I take a walk? Did I, check my blood pressure? Did I take
Mhm.
my antihypertensives?
Mhm.
Did I watch what I was eating? Did I cut back on this or that or do more of this or that
Mhm.
according to what my needs are?
Yeah.
That's what we're hoping,
Yes.
is that people will sort of wake up each day and say, I want to be able to think well throughout the entirety of my life. What do I need to do today to set the stage for that?
Thank you. And which is why I wanted to share that message as well. I think it's so vital, it's so important. You mentioned that everyone wants to feel better, but nobody wants to change. Why is it such a challenge for us? Especially when we have the information we need. I mean, sometimes it's lack of information. We don't know what we don't know. But when we do know, why is that? What do you find?
It's partly because we've become perfect,
Mm.
especially us men.
Ah.
Talk to any man over the age of 50, and he'll tell you it's pretty much perfect. Uh, Kidding aside, it's because I don't think we've ever been prepared for this idea that we're going to live in this latter 20, 30 years of our life, that it
Mhm.
was going to present unique challenges. Nobody takes any courses for retirement. I mean, you take courses for your work, you take courses for general functioning, special
Mhm.
trades, all kinds of things you get training for. And you get to retirement age and people retire. And then what? How they prepared themselves for the last 15 to 25 years of their life.
Mhm.
Partly because we get to midlife and we get set in our ways. We stop examining what's the next step. And so if somebody is telling you that they want you to change, or your body's telling you that what you're doing is not working, you're going to try to figure out any way possible to make it okay and not have to change.
Mhm.
People just don't want to. I really embrace it a different way. I look forward to change. I try to encourage people, all my patients, to really love change because it means that they're alive.
Mhm.
When you stop changing, you die.
Mhm.
Adaptation is the essence of life. So we have to change the way, and we also have to make it doable. Here's where you get into the world of those New Year's resolutions. Every December comes around, people start asking, so what are you going to do for the new year? What's your resolution? And people make resolutions that usually they've abandoned by Groundhog Day, sometimes
Right.
March.
Let last like 30 days, maybe
Yeah,
60 days.
those are the people who suddenly fill up
Mhm.
the treadmills
Yep.
at your gym.
Mhm.
And then by March, you can get a treadmill you want. So that's good because they're paying their dues, which helps to keep the cost for your dues at a lower level. But
Yep.
from their point of view, they don't set good goals to begin with. You say, what do you want to do for New Year's? What's your resolution? They say, I want to eat healthier. I say, what does that mean? What do you mean? What does it mean? I said, well, what are you going to do differently? Are you going to eat less? Are you going to eat differently? If so, what? Are you going to eat certain times because you're going to be on a time restricted eating pattern? Are you going to cut out something? Are you going to change the size of your plate so that it's smaller and it makes you feel more satisfied? Are you going to, what are you going to do? Because you have to come up with a detailed plan, at least starting somewhere, because I'm going to eat healthier is not an achievable goal. And then you have to start doing it with the expectation that it's going to fail. Why is that? Well, because the odds are it will. And at that point, you have to have the plan for getting back on it again. That's where a lot of times people go wrong because they think, okay, I've mastered this for the first week. I've been really good about this. Yeah, we've heard that story before. By week two, their resolve starts fading. They haven't set good goals. They start straying from what they're doing. And then they say, oh, what the heck? I guess it's unachievable. Next year's another year until
Right. I'll
December.
start again.
I'll make another resolution because they haven't figured out something. And I talk about this a little bit in the book. But I learned from the cable company is when something goes wrong with your cable, Don't even bother calling them. Just unplug it, let it sit for 15 or 20 seconds, plug it back in and restart it. And that's the same message I give people about habit change is you're going to go off the track. That's fine. That's expected. What you need to do is have a plan to unplug and restart the process, because that way, over the course of time, you're going to be able to stick to the plan.
And it's not giving up, right? We're not going to get it perfect when we, like you said, it's those actionable things that we want to implement and change, because it truly is lifestyle and habit that makes up, a lot of these factors. So
it also has to be small steps. You can't eat a burger in one bite. Well, you can, but you're going to choke.
Yeah.
You have to nibble.
Right.
And nibbling is much more effective, much more successful. So, for example, when someone says, I haven't been doing a good job with exercise, I tell them, take a 10-minute walk and then do it 2 more times today. I want you to take small steps because you can stick with them. You can squeeze them in. You don't have as many objections. It's hard to talk yourself out of a 10-minute walk.
Yeah.
What's your reasoning? Why can't you do this? They say, well, I could. I said, good, then do it. And then you feel accomplished, but then do it again.
Yeah.
And pretty soon you'll string those together. You'll get 30 minutes a day. If you're briskly walking for 30 minutes a day, you'll walk 10 miles this week. That's amazing. Most of the people who do that can't even imagine walking 10 miles.
Right.
But they could do it if they do it in small steps.
I love that key point. And you actually kind of answered my next question, which was for us feeling overwhelmed and we don't know where to start. It's taking one bite at a time, one step at a time. If we find that we've, gone off track, just get back on track. That can make a deep change.
And not beat yourself up for getting off track. That's also a very self-defeating kind of thing where people sort of give up because I'm never going to get this right. I've tried this before. And all that means is that you just haven't hit it yet. Just keep trying.
Keep trying, keep going. So for people reading the book and listening to our conversation today, what is the key message that you hope that they take away from dementia prevention?
Recognize that you have the power to make a substantial difference in your risk for cognitive decline. And as you get older, start doing something today. Learn about your own strengths and weaknesses. Figure out how you can wake up each day saying, I want to do something that's going to make my brain better now and in the future.
And as you say, stop being a dementia warrior and become a prevention warrior, which is what we're going to be doing now. And now I'm going to be telling everyone in my life all the things.
Excellent.
Another
acolyte going out there and carrying the dementia prevention banner. I love it.
I know, exactly. Thank you. I enjoyed this conversation so very much. And it was just a pleasure and a privilege to visit with you today. Thank you.
Absolutely my pleasure. Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you for listening today. If you enjoyed our episode, please subscribe and give us 5 stars. In all honesty, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for listening to our episode.